Garden Story was one of those games that I wanted to play as soon as I saw it for the first time. My earliest exposure to it was one of the Nintendo Indie World presentations, and it hit me just the right way. I'm a sucker for well-executed pixel art, and as much as I hate to admit it, I have a love for what are now known as wholesome games, which I think at this point is its very own subgenre of game development and game coverage, especially here on YouTube. It was clear from moment one that Garden Story was taking some notes from low-key life sim games like Animal Crossing, Harvest Moon, and Stardew Valley, and I like those games quite a lot. In one of those Nintendo Direct segments, Picogram also specifically said that the game was meant to foster a sense of community stewardship, which sounded great to me.
One of my goals for Garden Story is to inspire community stewardship and showcase the importance of coming together to help one another when times get tough.
With this apparent convergence of desirable traits, I assumed that I would buy Garden Story as soon as it came out, and I also assumed that I would review or talk about the game on the channel in some form, especially since I already made a pretty heavy review of Littlewood, which felt like the distillation of the key components of this particular style of game, especially on the indie level. Something I need to make very clear at the top is that Garden Story is not one of those games. It's really not very much at all like Animal Crossing or Stardew, except for maybe in some of its surface level components. It's not about building a town or forming relationships or farming or paying off loans or building and customizing your own home. And while I'm disappointed that Garden Story isn't the style of game I expected it to be based on the marketing materials, that's still not my main problem with the game. It's just a part of the main problem. It's been a while since I've wanted to detail some largely negative thoughts on a piece of media, but the time has come. I'm pretty darn frustrated with Garden Story, and as with Littlewood, which I actually enjoyed a lot more, I haven't come across any reviews that really dug into these problems. Though I will be getting into detail on a lot of this, I'll try to keep the video structure as simple as I can. Just positives and negatives, detailing each set. And yeah, the negatives section will be longer. And as with any mostly negative review I make, I need to give a very basic disclaimer. Some of this might sound obvious, but I need to say it for my own peace of mind. I'm not making this video to be mean. I'm not saying this game is worthless or empty. I think Picogram was the only developer working on Garden Story, but regardless of how big the team was, game development is extremely difficult, and making anything is an accomplishment, especially when you make something that looks this good. And of course, everything I say here is subjective and biased, just as all media criticism is inherently. But I think we're ready to go, so put on your wellies and let's get right down into the mud. There's mud in gardening, I assume. Garden Story's biggest asset is its art direction. I love this art. I know we've gotten more pixel art in the last 8 years than we ever really needed, but as with any category or medium, if we really want to call it that, there's always room for specific artists to make their mark, as it were. This game looks fantastic, not only in its static pixel art, but also in its animations. Characters have a great bounce to them, and the player character, Concord, has some absolutely fantastic animations. This is Concord using an item. This is Concord going to sleep, and this is Concord skipping down some stairs. In fact, when I first came across this animation, I spent about 3 minutes triggering it over and over, and even now, whenever it happens, it puts a smile on my face. From a purely visual perspective, the various color palettes fit each area perfectly, and each major area is themed around one of the 4 seasons. How the colors affect visual communication with regards to movement and gameplay is another topic, but we're not there yet. Likewise, the character designs are creative and fun, each of them based around some type of produce, essentially, except for a bunch of frogs and then some other creatures that just have their own names, I guess. Their animations aren't as elaborate as Concord's, obviously, but they all look good. One of my issues with Littlewood was that the art felt overly basic. So much of the appeal of that game seemed to be making my own cute little town, but to me, that aspect was very limited since I didn't really like how the individual buildings and items and characters looked. It just wasn't my taste. But this was another reason Garden Story hooked me before release. Making my own town or multiple towns within this style was incredibly exciting. Turns out you don't get to do that at all, but that's another topic coming up later. Lastly, the concept of helping to restore towns through little acts of kindness is excellent. I love restorative games, and in fact, it's a subject I've wanted to talk about at length, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet. New Horizons has a version of this. Littlewood definitely has it in the early part of the game. Breath of the Wild has it in little spurts, and House Flipper is almost entirely based around this concept. But does a Garden Story execute this premise well? No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. I think it's time to talk about the dark side. Oh my god, these transitions. Okay, there's a lot to talk about here, and I'm tempted to list every tiny detail I've come across that has harmed my experience in some way, but instead I will stick to complaints related to some larger categories that I want to hit on. The first set of problems revolves around poor communication. Specifically, I think the game itself does a bad job of communicating certain things, many of which are pretty important for the player to understand. The communication issues range from visuals to moment-to-moment gameplay, to gameplay systems, and all the way to the UI. I have so many problems here, and I get that some of this might be on me. Maybe I'm a dummy when it comes to some of this stuff, but for each of these aspects, I have played other games that handle them well, and I'll try to provide examples from other games when I can. Now, again, this is all about how the game communicates concepts to the player. We're not talking about progression or the primary gameplay loop quite yet. I'll give some context, but this part is focused just on learning to play the game, and I think it takes much longer than it should. I'm gonna bust out a really rough analogy here, but hopefully it'll get my point across. Imagine you buy this car, it's 20 years old, and it hasn't really been taken care of very well at all. So on the one hand, you know how to drive a car, right? You know the basics, but at the same time, each car has its own little quirks and differences, design choices that you just kind of have to get used to, whether you like them or not. But on top of that, it's just an old car. It's going to start falling apart, and there's going to be some stuff that you can actually fix, and then there's just going to be this other stuff. You just have to get used to it or find some kind of strange solution of your own. This is not an ideal situation. It would be really great to just only ever buy brand new luxury cars that have the latest technology and tons of convenience features, but that's just not always an option. Sometimes you wind up with the old car that's kind of fallen apart. Now, in many ways, Garden Story feels like the used car experience. In some ways, I've learned how to use certain features and systems as they were intended, and in addition to all that, I've also found my own workarounds for problems. Workarounds that definitely weren't intended by the developer. Time for specifics. The art is great, the areas look wonderful, but to me, it doesn't feel like any of these areas are really in need of my help, meaning like the little towns and settlements. In that way, they're almost too good on the visual side. Everything already looks cute and precious and sweet, but I'm supposed to believe that these towns are in real bad shape and that I'm the only one who can help them as the newly anointed guardian. But I never got that feeling, and I can think of several ways that the dire conditions of these towns could have been communicated to the player, but I'm not a dev, so maybe this stuff would have been too difficult to implement. For example, the saturation of the color palette in each area could have been started out quite low, making things look dreary, like the weather is constantly overcast. Then, as you help people and defeat monsters and bosses, each area would become more vibrant. I think that would be an effective visual way to give the player a sense of progress beyond character upgrades and the like. And this isn't even an original idea. Mario Sunshine did this exact thing in Delfino Plaza, the game's hub world, and I think it worked incredibly well in that game. It also had a direct connection to the game's main collectible, the shines. They emit light, you're collecting more and more of them, it just works out perfectly. In Garden Story, you're never literally changing the makeup of each town, but I think the saturation increase alone could have worked well to make you feel like you were helping, especially if executed with subtlety. Next up, regarding the game's visual language, is walkable spaces. I don't know if there's a specific term for this in game dev, but it just refers to the blocks in each each screen where the player can actively walk and move around. These spaces are limited by boundaries. Every game has boundaries, that makes sense. But how those boundaries are executed and communicated to the player is an important topic, especially in a game like this. I'll cut to the chase. I have problems with the boundaries in this game and how the walkable spaces are arranged and designed. First up, I have very often misinterpreted where I can and can't walk. If this was purely a life sim game like Littlewood or Stardew, it would be annoying and not much more than that. If you played the original Animal Crossing game, you know exactly what this is like. There were so many weird boundaries in important areas in that game, especially around ramps, and since you couldn't move anything around in your town, you just had to deal with the layout and the boundaries over the course of maybe 500 hours of gameplay. But Animal Crossing didn't have combat. This game places a huge emphasis on combat, but when you're in combat, you want to know exactly where you can go. This combat is pretty slow, and dodge rolling is hugely important. It also uses a completely unnecessary stamina system, so there are going to be times where you just have to get out of the action and recharge for a while. Concord's movement and attacking during combat is downright awful, and even if it wasn't, I would still be frustrated with these strange boundaries. Sometimes it's just misinterpreting which decorative objects you can walk through and which you can't, and other times there are invisible barriers that extend too far beyond their corresponding object. I'm sure it's a purely technical issue, but this is just not fun to deal with. I don't like having to guess where I'll be able to move while I'm in a fight. When I'm moving Concord around the map, I feel restricted. I find myself annoyed by the same boundaries and routes again and again and again, especially since I can't use the D-pad to move around. Movement never feels that good on its own, and it's only made worse by those weird boundaries again. And while we're on the topic of maps, areas, and navigation, I just don't like the layout of basically any of the towns or areas in Garden Story. Altogether, they're fairly large, but they're segmented in some strange ways. I don't know why. I'm fine with having to unlock different areas of the full map and being trapped in a specific zone for a while. But within each one, you have these tiny transitional areas, and moving between two screens triggers a short loading animation, which seems clearly modeled after the original Animal Crossing wipes. And something else that's not very well communicated here is that screens have their own names, but you can only find those names by scrolling through the map. And you both do and don't need to know the names of all those areas by heart. I'm gonna try to explain. It's kind of confusing. Okay, so a major part of the primary gameplay loop is fulfilling bulletin board requests specific to each town. Many of these requests mention specific areas, as in specific screens you'll need to travel to in order to fulfill the request. Fulfilling requests gives you money, and certain quests in each town contribute to story progression. Also, you have these different metrics to level up in each town. It's like combat, foraging, and something else. Sometimes you need to get a certain level on one of those to move forward. Now, when I was starting out with the game, I wanted to do these requests, but I didn't understand the area naming system, and despite walking through these different areas dozens of times, I never memorized the names, and even the town layouts never felt natural or memorable to me. Maybe it would have helped to have each area name pop up on the screen as soon as you entered it, like in the old Pokemon games. I don't think it would be too annoying, and I would have naturally memorized the area names much more easily. Also, the map doesn't display markers for the bulletin board requests, only for the main story quests, and it doesn't even let you look at the bulletin board requests on the map screen. You can't even see a list of them. It also doesn't let you look at your active favors, which are different from bulletin board requests and main story quests. Just give me a little dot, the same color as each bulletin board request type, of which there are 3, or you could let me place markers once I've checked all the little area names on the map and compared them to the area names on the requests. All of that is why it's important to actually know the area names, because you're going to be getting requests that are specific to these little areas, and you probably won't want to scroll through every section of the map every single time that you want to find an area you need to get to. But knowing all these area names is also not important at all at the same time for completely different reasons. So I'll be talking about this when we get into gameplay, but both optional and required tasks end up feeling like chores almost immediately. This feeling is heightened by how long it takes to get from one place to the other. And once you get into your groove in each area, you'll probably end up visiting every single screen belonging to each town every single day, or just about. Of course, this takes a lot of time, and it can contribute to a sensation of not really having any freedom to choose what you're doing to do each game day. And when you consider the tiny walkable spaces and weird boundaries, it just gets even more annoying to take these routes again and again and again and again. And not to mention all the constant copy-pasted enemies and terrible combat that are just everywhere for you to deal with. So when I started to get frustrated with having to look up all these different area names to do the tasks every single day, I just walked around as I pleased, and I found myself completing requests by accident. All I had to do was just remember the several types of repeated tasks, since they do repeat quite a bit, and then walk to every single screen within each town every single game day. Not ideal. And finally, it's time to talk about themes and gameplay, which is really the heart of what I wanted to discuss. All this other stuff was just a warm-up, so get ready. I don't think Garden Story's supposed themes and its gameplay line up at all. You may have heard the term ludonarrative dissonance before, and that's basically what I'm referring to here. It means that the gameplay and the game's story don't mesh well. They might even seem like they're in conflict with one another at times. I definitely think that's the case here. I already talked about how I thought the game would be a life sim and a town building game. Instead, it's a linear game focused on combat and tedious repeated chores. And I feel that both the gameplay and the ludonarrative dissonance would have been greatly improved or eliminated if it had just been what I originally thought it was. And it's not just the moment-to-moment gameplay that's harmed by the terrible combat. The sense of progression is also more or less absent. I really need to stress just how janky and Sisyphusian the combat feels. I've already explained that this is not a life sim town building game. In fact, I think describing it that way is borderline irresponsibly inaccurate. This is basically a top-down Zelda-style game, but one with a lackluster story and awful combat and occasional puzzles that feel little more than pedestrian when they appear. This already isn't my favorite game genre, but I also know that these types of games can be much better in all respects, and I know this because we've been getting tons of them from other indie developers for years. Here, I'll just look at some of the ones that I happen to own. Hyper Light Drifter has killer combat and subtle, impactful storytelling. Death's Door has some clever puzzles in addition to rock-solid combat and some lovely environmental storytelling. Sparklight isn't the most polished game out there, but the combat is reliable and the sense of progression is strong. What the Golf has both puzzles and occasional combat, sometimes simultaneously, and it feels wonderful to control, regardless of which control scheme you happen to be using. I'm not terrible at top-down combat either, but in Garden Story, I just cannot get into a flow. Whenever Concord switches his current tool or weapon and uses an item, it makes him face the camera, and that's not really something you want during combat. The enemies themselves are incredibly dull. The vast majority of enemies you'll encounter are your basic slime enemies, which are called Rot in this game. They basically just change colors based on the town, and even then I don't think they change for every town. Their attack is very easy to avoid, but after splatting them, they'll often leave behind this heart thing. I don't know why they couldn't just die. And depending on the type of heart thing, because I currently think there are two types, although I haven't seen any visual cues to distinguish them from each other, you're either going to get inked when you hit it or just take damage. These heart things move erratically, and since the hitboxes are unreliable, on top of Concord's strange movement during combat, I could take 2 or 3 hits from these things within just a few seconds, and it never really felt like it was my fault. There are some tougher enemies, including these giant slime guys who will fuck you right up, and difficult enemies would be fine if the combat felt good, but it just doesn't. The combat seems unfinished. And again, this game throws so many enemies at you, which is not only annoying, but also destroys your sense of progression as it relates to the story and the game's intentions. No matter how many you kill, they will be back the very next day, and unless it's attached to a quest, killing them has no real benefit, so they end up just being frustrating NPCs that get in the way while you're trying to go somewhere. They're just inconsiderate sidewalk pedestrians, elbowing people out of the way to travel in circles. Remember that quote I brought up earlier about how Picogram wanted to foster community stewardship with this game?
One of my goals for Garden Story is to inspire community stewardship and showcase the importance of coming together to help one another when times get tough.
Other games have already generated this sensation extremely well. I already mentioned games that have scratched that itch for me personally, but in a very general sense, I think there are some basic ways to make the player feel like they're having a positive impact on the game world, and I don't think Garden Story does these things. You can reward the player in meaningful ways, and you can also give them proof that the game world is changing for the better. Other games reward you by giving you skill points, useful items or weapons, or by unlocking new mechanics or abilities. Garden Story rewards the player mostly by giving them money. You get tiny amounts of money for killing enemies, and completing requests gives you larger amounts of money. But money isn't very important in this game. You can buy item upgrades and cosmetic items for Concord. Fine, but not great. It also has this perk system, but I rarely found a perk that I actually wanted to equip. So how do other games provide proof of positive impact? Well, I talked about how Mario Sunshine makes the hub world brighter and more vibrant and cheery. New Horizons has evolving score music that becomes more full as the island community grows, with more instruments and a more enthusiastic sound.
It does undergo small changes as your town grows, though. The guitar chords become more rhythmic and played more confidently, until eventually your island is ready to be a full-fledged town.
Breath of the Wild lets you create an entire town that then offers useful shops and a safe area deep in a dangerous part of the map. In Origami King, as you rescue toads, more of them appear in the town. In Stardew Valley, you make friends who give you valuable items, you revive the town's community spirit, and you drive out a corporate outpost. You also remove dozens of unsightly boulders and pieces of debris. Garden Story kind of does this stuff, but only kind of. Some of the bulletin board requests involve repairing fixtures, both major and minor, but only the major ones actually stick. All the other stuff will eventually break again, just for you to fix again. And again, you can craft items and place them in very specific spaces, sometimes providing more light at nighttime, which is nice, but they mostly blend in with what was already there. Also, most of the time, crafting and placing these items isn't related to the main story progression at all. So if you don't have the time or the extra materials, why even bother with it? I also never felt like I was making a difference because I didn't care about the characters. It's not that the dialogue is poorly written, but there's very little difference between how each of the characters speak, except for a slightly annoying dialect local to one of the towns. The game never made me feel invested in these characters, and if I'm honest, I started to dislike Concord too, despite his adorable animations and his total lack of dialogue. I don't even know how this happened. Maybe I started to get sick of his stupid smile and his infantile grimaces. Maybe his constant misses and clumsy damage during combat made the character seem kinda dumb. And when I no longer even liked my character and didn't have any feelings for the other villagers, my motivation was just gone. And now I get to explain why making this a life sim town building game would solve basically all of these problems. Okay, so picture this. You are a young grape named Concord, and you're the new guardian. That's already how Garden Story starts, and I think it's just fine. You can even keep the early tutorial sections that teach you about combat, shops, and various mechanics. But for the whole stretch, you are accompanied by the former guardian. This guardian is near death, and even while you're performing the tutorial tasks, he just keeps talking, telling stories about the old days and what priorities he set for himself to be a good leader. The player can choose to read or to not read these text boxes, since they can move around freely while these stories are being told. When you visit towns, we see how the other characters respond to this guardian and his leadership style. Then you reach a final tutorial where you're forced to make a choice. The guardian's instructions sound questionable, so you're forced to actively question his approach and even whether or not he can be trusted to tell the truth and do what's right. I had to stop for some water. I've been talking for so long and it hurts my throat. Back to the pitch. Okay. One day, the former guardian just disappears, venturing out into the wilds in the middle of the night. It's assumed that he's dead or lost forever, so you become the official guardian much sooner than anticipated. This ends the tutorial section. You still fulfill requests, both trivial and important, but all of these are called the same things. Let's just say missions, and they're all visible in one of your menus. Ideally, the map menu. All missions are the same color, but progression missions have a little grape symbol next to them. Like many other games, you can choose multiple missions whose waypoints you want to appear on the map. Combat only happens in dungeons, which the game already has, complete with boss battles. These areas are generally wide open, giving you room to roll. The enemies can increase in difficulty with each dungeon. Otherwise, when moving around the overworld, your focus goes to items that can be foraged and to the ugly, damaged buildings or decorations. Collapsed roofs, broken fences, large stretches of dead grass and dirt. In fact, when it rains, these default barren tiles could slow your movement slightly, further motivating you to seed them and get them looking nice. The towns are still there, but they're ugly, depressing, and mostly empty. The few remaining residents are downtrodden, their usual work non-existent thanks to serious damage or disaster, or maybe because the local video game boss went on a rampage. Each town has one very clear repair job, each of which might require multiple steps to complete, including beating the boss. Each town can be damaged at night, even after you've started to restore it, but you can take measures to protect it from monsters. This could be building fences, which can be upgraded, or installing traps with big rewards when you capture a monster. Heck, you could even modify houses so that they stand up better to direct attacks. Maybe as you help people out, they volunteer to keep watch, which just decreases the chance of damage. Grateful residents give you items or teach you new abilities. You can still unlock new areas in exactly the same way and progress through the story, though I would probably modify the specifics of the story pretty heavily. We don't really have time for that now, but maybe have that guardian character come back in the end and you have to stand up to him. Just basic stuff. You can build new houses in the towns and buildings, and you can build fixtures as well, attracting more residents who give buffs to either you or the town as a whole. This setup would solve almost all of the issues I've mentioned in this video. Most importantly, I would actually feel a sense of agency and ownership. Agency to make a difference and also to do whatever I want on a given day, and then the sense of ownership over the towns and the homes where my character lives. As things are now, I'm not motivated to play Garden Story. No single part of its gameplay is very fun. It's not relaxing either. I just feel like I'm doing chores and I don't really know why. And in fact, when I was going back to capture footage for this review, I was usually enthusiastic at the start, and then 20 minutes later, I just wanted it to stop. I just wanted to quit in the middle of a game day. I don't enjoy it. At the same time, I don't feel like I'm customizing anything, and I don't feel like I'm making things better for these characters. It's a game that feels like it sits between. Garden Story isn't quite a Zelda-style game, it isn't quite a restoration game, and it isn't quite good either. Not only did it feel like it missed the mark, but it felt like I could see the mark right there, 2 inches from where it hit. There is still a lot to admire about Garden Story, especially if Picogram was the only developer, but so much of it doesn't really work for me, to say the least, and I don't know how likely it is that any of this will change with future updates. This might be it. However, if Picogram led another game alongside some other devs, and I had an accurate idea of what it actually was ahead of time, I would probably buy it, almost for the visuals alone. Okay, I think I'm done. That's just about my longest scripted video in a while, but only because I really felt motivated to talk about this. I hope I haven't made myself seem like a monster. I just didn't enjoy Garden Story or its monsters. I'm also kind of worried that wholesome YouTube channels that recommend cozy, wholesome games are going to see the visuals of Garden Story and assume it's basically like Littlewood and Animal Crossing, but I don't think people looking for those kinds of experiences are going to enjoy spending hours fumbling through terrible combat to save some dead-eyed villagers. Thanks for joining me for the whole thing, and now I need to go take a vacation or something. It's been like 3 years, and it's starting to show. Okay, goodbye.